Well, I finally get my hands on an Indian FTR1200 and the British autumn throws everything at me that it can. Thankfully though, the day before the bike was due to go back, the sun came out and that gave me the chance to show you what this 1200 base model is all about. Just looking backwards for a second, the bike came about because the Indian wanted to bring their FTR750 championship winning flat track racer to the street and make that style of bike accessible to the general public. But for the road going version, the engineers decided not to go with the 750 motor and instead fitted it with the first high performance motor that wasn't focused around their cruiser bikes. So what you get is a 1203cc V-twin motor that puts out 123 horsepower and 120 newton meters of torque at 6,000 RPM. And you know what that means? That means a hell of a lot of fun. The punch from this bike is absolutely intoxicating. The bike really does get up and go, and it just keeps going. The thing is phenomenal. One thing you do have to be mindful with this being the base model, you have no traction control, and that is something you've got to watch, particularly in the wet and particularly on those Dunlop tyres, but I'll come to those later. It's been described in many ways, but the word beast does come up quite often. Of course there are faster bikes out there, but the power delivery that this gives is hugely satisfying. But it's not all blood and thunder. This bike is quite happy cruising around town. It does have a well-mannered, easygoing side as long as it's warmed up. The closed loop fuel injection system means that the engine runs on a basic map until it reaches a temperature of around 63 degrees. Then the O2 sensors kick in, and this does mean that when the bike is cold, I found it to be quite snatchy. It's very off and on. If you're not used to it, it can catch you out a little bit. Once it's warmed up, which only takes a couple of minutes, I had no issues with the fueling, but on cold starts it is something that you need to be aware of. This is of course the base model, so it doesn't have the high-end suspension that the S model does. It also doesn't have the rider modes and the cornering ABS and cornering traction control, but it does have a few nice features that come as standard. One of which that I wasn't expecting was cruise control. Whether you need that or not on a bike like this is open to debate, but I found it useful from time to time, and it's very easy to operate from a little flick switch on the left hand control. Another standard feature which really is very handy is a high-speed USB port. It sits up front on the Speedo housing, which is exactly where it needs to be, and I have to admit that some of the other so-called high-spec bikes that I've tried don't actually have an accessible USB port. The use of mobile devices for satellite navigation is now very commonplace, so some of the other manufacturers, please take note. Whilst I'm on the subject of speedometers, the base model has the round analog stroke LCD clock as opposed to the TFT screen on the S. And I do have to say, I think I prefer this version. It's more in keeping with the bike, but it still has everything on the Speedo that you would want. You can see the current charge level in the battery, the engine temperature, the bike's average fuel consumption, its current fuel consumption, mileometer, trip computer, and a digital rev counter. I do have to say that I was really impressed with the overall build quality and the level of finish on the bike. Wherever you look on this bike, there are fantastic details. Whether it's the funky LED lights that you'll find all around the bike, particularly that rear tail light, the raised Pro Taper bars, which by the way offer fantastic control, the Brembo brake levers and the engine casings and all of the mouldings on that, everywhere you look on this bike, it's all nicely done. Having spent a week living with the bike, what do I think it would be like long term? Well, I have to say I really enjoyed it. Let's start off with comfort. It's ergonomically, I think, really well set up. It's a very comfortable bike to ride, given its flat track look and the appeal that they're going for. I was initially worried that it wouldn't be particularly comfortable. In actual fact, the riding position is fantastic. You're canted just enough forward to get some weight over the bars, but you're not putting any pressure on your wrists. The foot pegs are not too high and not too far back, and the seat is much more comfortable than first impressions would suggest. In fact, I would possibly even go as far to say that the seat was more comfortable over a long distance than my Tiger 800. It's amply upholstered, but it's quite wide and quite broad and offers you a good level of support. You've got a little tail as well, so that you can push your backside back into that. Gives you a little bit of extra support, but that little movement of the hip seems to clear up any aches and pains. I rode this back from Indian HQ back to my house, which took me about 3 hours, and other than the usual aches and pains you'd get from a journey of that length, I had no ill effects, and that really surprised me. It's also pretty economical for a big burly bike. The gauge showed that I averaged around 53 miles per gallon, which isn't too bad. And because the way Indian have designed the tank with a fuel cell that sits underneath it, and the main tank that you see is largely a dummy plastic tank with all the electronics underneath it, it's actually got a 13 litre fuel capacity. And that proved enough to give a range of about 130, 140 miles before you were having to start to look for your next fuel stop. So let's start to wrap this up. We've established that the bike goes well, it's well put together, it's comfortable, it stops well, and the noise from the stock exhaust is absolutely fantastic. I didn't tell you this, but the guy at Indian, when I picked the bike up, he said that he thought the stock pipes on this base model actually sound better than the Akrapovic slip-ons. I can't comment on that, and I guess Indian want you to go out and buy those to fit to your bike, but I have to say the exhausts that come with it as stock do emit a beautiful deep burble. So I've said a lot of good things about this bike, and as you could probably tell, I'm quite smitten with it. Are there any negatives though? Well, other than fueling that I've already talked about, the big negative for me were the choice of tyres. Now, of course, I realise this is a flat track inspired bike, and it probably wouldn't look right if it didn't have flat track style tyres. So the bike is fitted with a pair of Dunlop DT3 R tyres, 150/70/18 on the rear, 120/70/19 on the front, and these are a specially made set of tyres for this bike, which are a road legal version of Dunlop's DT3 competition only tyre, which is only usually available in the standard flat track size of 19 inches. But for me, the combination of this tread and the compound just added an unnecessary vibration to the ride of the bike. If it was my own bike, I'd probably sacrifice the looks a little bit and put a more road biased tyre on just to smooth things out a little bit. I doubt very much that these bikes are going to see any dirt, and I certainly don't think that many of these bikes are actually going to be raced on flat track circuits. So the tyre makes sense, but for me it was one of the very few negatives that I found with this bike. Indian have certainly fulfilled their aim of building a flat track bike for the road, and I think actually the 1200 base model would be the one that I would choose. It is a real back to basics bike. You haven't got all of the electronics on it. You've got a big, raughty, powerful torque field engine, and you control that with your right hand. It's a fantastic bike to look at. It's a fantastic bike to ride. It does everything very well, despite the slightly slack head angle, which you'd expect from this style of bike. It handles very well indeed, and it's certainly a bike that I would have in my garage. Arguably it offers the same visceral experience as the S model, but for less money. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch the review. If you've got any comments or questions, you know where to put them down below, and all that leaves me to say is until next time, thanks for watching, take care, ride safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.